What's up, you guys? Welcome back to lesson 2 of confirmation, and today we're going to be talking about this guy. Can you see him? Can you see him? So the reason we're talking about scripture today, the reason we're talking about reason, is because I can't even begin to tell you how many times, even in college, the conversation of religion would get brought up, and people would always associate Christianity with kind of just blindly following the masses, or like Christianity with this nice kind of fluffy thing that we just do because mom and dad tell us to, and their parents did it, and their parents did it, and it just makes us feel all warm and fuzzy inside, and there's really no reason behind any of it. And I was thinking to myself, this could not be further from the truth. Like our Catholic faith has so many reasons, okay? There's not a single thing that the church teaches or that she does or that we do during Mass or that we proclaim as Catholics that is done for no reason. There's not a single thing. I can't think of a single thing. But there is not a single thing that the Catholic Church does that is for no reason, okay? It's all for a reason. There are reasons for our faith, and we're gonna talk about it, okay? We're gonna talk about it. That's the question of the day. Okay, so let's talk about this thing. What is this? What is this? Who are you? What are you? I was listening to a podcast one time, and it was a conversation between two men who proclaimed themselves to be atheists. And at the end of the episode, one of them said, if God existed, then how on earth could he create this book and have it be so boring? Like, if God loved us, wouldn't he want us to have something a little more entertaining? And I thought to myself, that is the most bananas way to reason your way through life, right? Because here's the deal. This large little gold-bound, beautiful thing, it is not a book, okay? The word Bible actually comes from the Greek word biblia, which means books or a collection of books. So this thing that I love that I'm holding is a library. I'm holding a library in the palm of my hand. Do you see this? It's a whole library. The thing that you guys picked up on your first parent meeting with us, that little Bible that was shoved into that manila envelope, we gave you guys a library. You're welcome. So here's the deal. If we want to read this thing and understand exactly what God intends for us to understand, we have to think of it as a collection of books, as a library. And I don't know about you guys, but when I walk into a library, I'm not expecting to read a magazine the same way that I'm expecting to read a dictionary. And I don't expect to read a dictionary the same way that I'm going to read poetry or romance or any other genre, right? And so even within the confines of this little library, there are multiple different genres, okay? So what are some of these genres? Some of them are poetry, for example, with some of the Psalms. Some of them are meant for instruction, like the books and the letters of St. Paul, Corinthians, and Hebrews, and all the letters that St. Paul writes for our instruction, for us to understand something. Another sense is some of these genres in this book are nonfiction, like the Gospels, things that actually happened and we're supposed to understand as reality, right? And so if there are different genres of the Bible, then there are different ways that we need to approach reading it. We need to have a critical eye to be able to say, this is how I'm supposed to interpret this gospel passage, or this is how I'm supposed to interpret this poem that has rhyme and alliteration and reason behind it, right? So there are different ways that we are supposed to have a sense about us, different ways that we are supposed to look at Scripture. And the Catechism has 4 different types of ways. The first way that we can look at Scripture, and this way kind of supersedes every other way, is through the literal sense. So the literal sense, the way that we can see Scripture literally, is basically when meaning is conveyed by the words of Scripture and discovered by exegesis, or kind of extracting information. It's following rules and sound interpretation. And from this one, all other senses follow. The second way that we can interpret Scripture is through the moral sense. This is by reading stories and looking at the events that are reported in Scripture and leading in a way that leads us to act justly. So St. Paul even writes this in his letters for our instruction. Like, how are we supposed to live morally in the world? The third way that we can look at this is the allegorical sense. This is one where we see these stories as what they are, as allegory, things that are happening in the moment, but that point to something that was going to happen later on, foreshadowing, some might say. An example of this might be when Moses institutes Passover way back in the Old Testament, when he's trying to free the Israelites under Pharaoh's reign. And he has all of the Israelites slaughter the lamb, sacrifice an unblemished lamb, so that they might be passed over, so that they might be saved, right? And all of that is to point towards Jesus, who is the Paschal Lamb, who is unblemished, who is going to be slaughtered or sacrificed for the saving of the world. That's one way, that's a third way to look at it. And then the final way that we can look at Scripture is with the Anagogical Sense. And so this is kind of termed leading. And it's basically a way that we can view Scripture, that we can view the realities and events in terms of their eternal significance to us. So one way that this might happen is if we're looking at the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and we see that we can compare them on the journey and trying to understand with the journey of my own spiritual life, that over time I too am trying to have the Scriptures opened up to me, that I too am trying to get to know Jesus and understand, so much so that it might end with the breaking of the bread, right? So I think in trying to understand all of these different senses of Scripture and the way that we can read and think about the Bible, one of the most important things that we have to know is that we cannot look at this thing as a scientific textbook, right? If we are just trying to extract answers about the way that the earth physically functions, we have to look a little bit deeper. There's so much more than that, and that is present in here in some circumstances. But there's also relationship and history and story and poetry and things that are more sensitive to the human heart that accompany science. And they all kind of flow together to allow us to go deeper into understanding how the world was made and how we're supposed to be within the world. So the fact that we can think critically about our faith points to the fact that Catholicism upholds this idea of having a religion of both faith and reason. Yes, on this one side we have our aspect of faith where we make an assent to something that is above ourselves, right? Where we adhere to someone who is more powerful, more all-knowing than we are, out of love, right? But on this other side we have reason. We have the gift of our intellect, right? And that informs our will, the way that we act out in the world. And so all of these things come together to form how we are supposed to interact with the world as Catholics, in a world using both our faith and our reason to inform our decisions. And this is not a new concept. This is so beautiful. We did not just all of a sudden in the 21st century start saying, hey, we should start thinking about things. We should start studying, right? This has been an aspect of our faith since its inception, since the Last Supper, right? Like, these men have been studying and passing on information to all of us throughout history, informing society, permeating even the different fabrics of society than just philosophy and religion, right? And so what are some examples of that? These are just a few of the men and women whose faith lives and whose pursuit of truth and reason have impacted the way society functions, have impacted the world. So the first is Father Gregor Mendel. He was an Augustinian friar whose work served as the basis of modern genetics. You might have even heard of him in some of your biology classes, or you will learn about him in high school, I'm sure. He created the Punnett squares, which was to determine the likelihood that certain traits would be inherited by offspring. And so working with pea plants, he did this, and he eventually determined that genes are inherited in pairs and that there are dominant and recessive genes. And this is incredibly important for the functioning of biology in today's society, for all the studies being done to create and preserve life. Another one, we have Roger Bacon, who was a Franciscan friar who criticized the blind acceptance of ideas and emphasized the need to test and examine things, which is what a lot of Christians are accused of today, that we just blindly accept things. But Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar, he said, no, this is not what we do. And so his work wasn't perfect, obviously, as a lot of, I know my work's not perfect, and a lot of these men in history, it's not perfect, but basically, Roger Bacon's ideas served as the foundation of the modern scientific method, which I'm sure you've talked about in your science classes, and you certainly will in high school. And then finally, and this is one of my favorite ones, this is the one when I heard it, I knew that this was the real deal, that this Catholic faith was the real deal. So Father Georges LeMaitre, he was a Belgian Catholic priest and contemporary of Einstein, Basically, he worked side by side with Einstein during the same time. And so LeMaitre was known as the father of the Big Bang Theory. So when he first proposed this theory, Einstein told him that he was a fool and that his physics were nonsense. Could you imagine being told by Albert Einstein that you were a fool? I cannot imagine that. I'm sure it was really embarrassing, but this guy was. And then LeMaitre persisted, and after a few years, Einstein was even convinced that this thing called the Big Bang Theory was, in quotes, the most satisfactory explanation of the origins of the universe. So these are just a few of the ways that men and women throughout history have impacted the world scientifically through their Catholic lens. And it's all because these ideas of faith and reason, we uphold as Catholics that they do not oppose one another, but they actually enhance each other for the betterment of ourselves individually, for the option of salvation, but also for the betterment of the world. And so my prayer going forward is that you and I might be able to use our faith and reason as tools, so that we too might be able to say, and as Psalm 19 says, the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament proclaims the works of his hands. That we can understand what he's done for the world, what he's done for us scientifically, that we can understand those things, but also what it means for me as a human being going forward. So thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next time. Check out those questions that we'll send to you and go ahead and answer those, and we'll catch you next time.